I don't believe that books need to be finished from beginning to an end. Like even the person who's writing a book, if you've ever written anything in your life, like a project, a thesis, or even if you wrote a short story or a book, is that you approach it kind of like from multiple dimensions. You dabble into your manuscript, and then you step back again and you go back in, and then the books are written in exactly the same way. Welcome to On Emergence, a podcast on what it takes to be a human being. I'm Sagen, your host and a fellow human being. In this podcast, we talk about the multifaceted, complex experience of being a human. We use different lenses of philosophy, often philosophy, modern science, spirituality, psychology. And the conversations I find myself in during that podcast fascinate me multiple times because I get to edit them and re-listen to them carefully and all those beautiful nuggets of wisdoms that I get to hear firsthand. And I'm so excited that you tuned in to this week's episode because the topic is one of my favorite ones. It's snacking on books, snacking on knowledge. And the first time I actually came across this topic or this realization is that I was in an airport and I realized I'm craving something. And instant my mind was like, oh, maybe I'll crave a snack and a brownie. And then I was like, wait a minute, no, I think I need something. I feel like I need a feeling, but that feeling is not accessible through eating. It's not accessible through food. I was like, what is it that I want? And I realized that was the first time I caught myself thinking that I want to learn something. I want to have a different perspective on something. I want to feel a certain way that this perspective can offer me. And I knew exactly what type of knowledge that I was craving for, what type of information I was craving at that time. And since then, the story of me snacking on books really began. And I have a stack of books next to my bed that I dabble in. I don't believe that books need to be finished from beginning to an end. Like even the person who's writing a book, if you've ever written anything in your life, like a project, you know that the way that you approach a project, like a thesis, or even if you wrote a short story or a book, that you approach it kind of like from multiple dimensions. You dabble into your manuscript, and then you step back again and you go back in, and then the books are written in exactly the same way. Even the editors, they dabble into the book reading. They come into it and then they leave and then they edit the book the same way. So the books are not linear. Yes, they may look linear, they have beginning of an end, but it's perfectly okay to start a book in the middle of it, especially when it comes to nonfiction books. I read a lot of nonfiction books. I don't tend to read fiction very often because I feel that it requires a lot more linearity, a lot more kind of sticking with it. You need to follow the story. Whereas I like reading books that are non-linear, that I can dabble into and I can come in and out. Also, there is another thing when it comes to reading fiction books is that unexpected stuff can happen, and I don't want to be traumatized from reading that. It's like if you ever read Game of Thrones or if you watch the series, imagine reading it. That was a shocker. Sometimes I had to reread. I was like, oh my God, what did just happen? Did this character just died? So I tend to dabble in nonfiction books a lot more, and I read a variety of subjects. But what I've noticed is that I have this feeling of, okay, this is the type of information I want to consume. But when it comes to dabbling into books is that I know what type of information I'm hungry for. So sometimes I have a cookbook next to my bed, and it's a book that breaks down cooking across 4 different axes of salt, fat, acid, and heat. So it's a very scientific approach to cooking. And sometimes I read it before bed. I kind of like try to pick it up from the moment I stopped, but it doesn't always begin in the same spot. And I allow myself that. I allow myself to snack on different knowledge. When I open the book, sometimes I open it in the middle. I was like, oh, that's exactly where I needed to open it. I just trust that is exactly where I need to be, which I know is not a usual, normal way to read books. And of course, I start books a lot of the times from the beginning. It's kind of like understand the concept. And then I flick through it. That's why I I really like physical books. I love my Kindles, but physical books, it just invites that journey where you can just flick through it. You kind of have to be linear in your Kindle or ebook. But with physical books, you can be completely circular. You can start from the end if you wanted to. So you kind of like your brain arrives to that kind of knowing what the ending of the book is going to be helps you understand the author better, the author train of thought better. So that's another way of looking at reading books. And don't be obsessed about finishing a book. I don't think that books are meant to be finished, at least not all of them, far from all of them. Some books are meant to be written. Some books are meant to be bought and opened only once. And that is their sole value. If that is your experience with a book, with this piece of knowledge, stay with it. And life is a long song. You might come back to it. Certain books, they come on a path multiple times until the moment that we read them. And I find that is so incredibly beautiful. I had this thing where I would not buy books until I read all the books that I already bought. And I have a very dear friend who is a book collector. And he was like, yeah, at some point I had to give up on this because I certainly have books that I probably will never end up reading, but I just keep buying them. It's about the ability to access that information when you need it. It's like, think about it when you are stocking your pantry. You're not going to eat all those canned tomatoes all at once. You're not going to eat all those ingredients that you bought, right? So that is the way that I tend to think about books. And sometimes you open a packet of pasta and you use a little bit of it to make a meal because you have a certain craving. That is the same way that I look at books. It's just like sometimes it's just like mixing up in a cocktail of information that I'd like to consume right now. And I can put it a little bit later. And I was like, oh, that book that I was reading, I want to experience that feeling, that insight. My brain needs that type of tickle. So think about books that way. The books were not written in a linear way. The writer kept coming in and going, and they rearranged the chapters. I can guarantee you, I've written books before. You rearrange the chapters, you rearrange the paragraphs. I write a lot. Just generally, this is how I think. And sometimes it requires some rearrangement of paragraphs, even if I'm writing for myself. So no wonder that sometimes we feel like, oh, we want to leave the book on the side. It kind of makes sense that we might want to leave a book on the side, or we might want to go back to some other part, or maybe we start from the middle of the book, because books are not written linearly. I keep saying that. And I hope that the next experience of a book, of holding a book in your hand, is going to be a joyful one. That's one of the reasons why I love going to bookstores. It's like, oh my God, it's there's an expression of kid in a candy store, and then there is my favorite place on the planet. And I've been to a few places, but this is the place that brings me solace and joy and peace, and I could spend a lifetime there. It's a bookstore on Piccadilly in London, Waterstones, and it spans 6 stories, so 6 floors, and all of it is different books. They have sofas where you can read them. And I would normally come up and then pick a stack of books, and I would just like dabble in them. And I would pick some of them with me. So I would buy some of them. Some of them I would just leave behind. But for me, it's like this experience of going to a Michelin star restaurant is like I get to experience it all. And I make my own meal by picking the books that I want to read. As a society, I find that there's a little bit of obsession. I was like, oh, how many books have you read? It's like, oh, from start to finish, I finished the project. But like, is it really what reading books is about? Isn't it about experience? Isn't it about the feeling that this book is trying to create by sharing all those words with you? It's not about each and every word of the book that you read. It is about understanding the writer's perspective. It is about connecting with a feeling that the writer wanted to create. It's like the same thing as looking at the painting and be like, do I see every single stroke in order to appreciate the painting? No, you just look at the painting and you take in the feeling. I know it's a little bit an unconventional way to look at books and writing, but maybe this is something that you can benefit from, something that could be useful or that you could resonate. Thank you for tuning in today to talk about books, to talk about knowledge, to talk about dabbling in knowledge and snacking on knowledge. I'd love to hear your perspective. I'd love to hear what you thought about it and what's your relationship to reading, to books, to the non-linearity of writing and non-linearity of reading. We can connect on Instagram. My handle is On Emergence. And I often share a backstory and expand a little bit more in other dimensions of the topic I just covered. And I publish those on the website, onemergence.com. As always, I'm Laura Sagen, your host and a fellow human being. Until next Tuesday.